Caddis Maximus here, this time with a quick review of the Harbor Freight Heavy Duty Chain Breaker, item 66488. And even though it clearly says or bicycle chains, motorcycle or bicycle chains, it is actually not compatible with bicycle chains. I bought it to use on the larger industrial chain that had 5/8 pitch, but it does tell you these chain sizes, and all those are larger than bicycle chains. And the real nature of the issue, and I'm not exactly sure where the error came from, but I went back to Harbor Freight and the others that were on the shelf. I've had this for quite a while, actually, probably about a year, but they still sell them. Is that they advertise an 1/8 inch diameter extracting punch, and it's not. It's a 5/32. And I'm not sure where that error occurred from. So this is just a fine chain breaker for working on actual motorcycle chains and, you know, larger than bicycle, industrial and power transmission chains. And it is built pretty well. The body is cast, but it's still not too bad. It actually has a hardened steel anvil, and it does have indeed replaceable dies. The replacement die that it comes with is the same size, 155 thousandths, 5/32, or just under 4 millimeters. For a bicycle chain, you actually do need 1/8 inch, or most of them, the good ones, measure 130 thousandths, which is about 3.3 millimeters. And it's just weird that they had that that was just real strange. You know, somebody marketing just assumed this was a universal chain breaker when there actually is a difference in pin sizes with chain breakers. That being said, it does have an not an interchangeable handle, but you can, it does have a handle that you can remove. I think just to get it to fit in the packaging. Most times you'd leave this out of the packaging, although I did want to mention that the die nut does have very fine threads. And what has surprised me is that the threads are super fine. 30 threads per inch or something like that. And you set it down on the workbench, and the few particles that it will pick up from setting down on a workbench cause it to get all funky inside there and get difficult to thread in and out. You do want to lube the threads, but I did want to point that out. They really like to stay very, very clean. So what's interesting about this, and what I kind of liked about it, is that you could adjust the pin. The pin is spring-loaded and driven by a ball bearing with this inner nut. And so what you would do with a heavier chain is you would just use the larger bolt, which is much more rigid, with the pin all choked up or drawn back as far as possible. And then you would start to do the pushing operation, pushing out the pin until this came to a stop or near the bottom. And then what's nice is then you could use this one to continue to push the pin the rest of the way out. And as you can see, as I thread that in, the die or the punch starts pushing through, and so that's how I used it. I used the thicker portion to get it started, and so that the pin wouldn't want to get bent or move sideways. And then as I got towards the bottom, it was actually a little bit thicker than this. The bottom of this would hit and kind of hold the chain, which was nice. And then you could just simply focus on threading in this inner nut and push the pin the rest of the way out in a nice controlled fashion. So I really did like that. These are a metric. That's a 14 millimeter and a 17 millimeter down there. And this has gotten jammed up. Let's take a look inside. I'll use this card to prevent particles from getting on this little bolt. And there we go. We have a little ball bearing there, which sits in a little divot in the center of the flake of metal right there, right in the center of that drive bolt. And then you have the pin. And then the pin, just has a little divot in the middle, and then the spring, which is what allows it to retract. So when you're pushing that inner anvil, it crushes the spring all the way down. And so you do want to be careful not to drive this inner bolt in all the way, otherwise you'll kind of jam up and bend up the spring. And the replacement anvil is exactly the same thing, or I should say die or punch. Now the issue with them advertising as a bicycle chain is it's just completely false, because the diameter of both of these pins, 155, so 5/32, just a hair under 5/32. That's 155.5. So those are 5/32 pins for some reason. Just under 4 millimeters if we convert that to millimeters. So almost 4 millimeters. And then we measure bicycle chain tools such as this Park CT5. It's definitely a bicycle chain tool. We can see that's 130 thousandths. And if we take the chain tool from my little Alien here and we measure it, it's actually a genuine 1/8 inch. So the one in my Alien tool is the one that really is the 1/8 inch. The Park is just a little bit thicker, which is, one of the reasons you buy a Park is they try to do that, such as squeeze in a slightly larger piece in there just so it's a little bit more rigid. But these pins definitely don't work, Here's a SRAM PC58 or PC59. This ain't going through. Same thing on this Park chain tool. That's a Z chain on it. This ain't going through. So it's just interesting that they made such a gross error with this tool, advertising it as accepting a chain size that it doesn't. And so as far as loading this thing up, it's actually pretty easy because you just drop all the parts back into it and then just get this inner bolt threaded. And once it starts to engage on the inner pin, you're already in about 10 turns on this. So I was initially worried about, using the large bolt and trying to punch out the center pin. That initial movement, the initial getting it upset is where the highest force is. Worried about, damaging or stretching the threads, but it turns out that they did compensate for that. So this bolt threads in pretty deep before it even starts to move the center anvil. So I did appreciate that about it. Overall, it's not a bad chain tool. It's actually pretty easy to use. The handle position, the shape is actually pretty nice to get a pretty good grip on it. And you can always pull this out and replace it just with a long bolt if you wanted even a longer handle. So for the price of this tool, it's actually, I liked it. It just seemed weird that they would advertise as being for bicycle chains, particularly if they didn't include the spare anvil. And that may have been what was intended for these, is that they had a larger 5/32 or 4 millimeter anvil, and they were going to include an 1/8 inch, and just somehow some error occurred where it just, all the packages ended up coming with the 4 millimeter or 5/32 drive punches. So always disappointing. Maybe, one of these months or something, I will take a look at another package to see maybe if they've, had enough complaints or been made aware of the error and they include 2 different pins, or maybe they change the packaging, excuse me. One other thing I was going to mention is it does have a nice amount of range, so if you need to work on a very wide chain, you can, because this inner piece, and I need to hold this with a wrench, you can see that you have quite a bit of range. There we go. Now you can see that there is just a huge amount of range for that pin to come down. So you can work on very, very wide chains and be able to push the pins all the way through. So that was one selling aspect, or one reason I did buy it, is because it actually has pretty good range and it is built pretty well, even if it doesn't have a forged steel body. So anyway, that was the end of a quick review and overview of the Harbor Freight Heavy Duty Chain Breaker that for me was advertised as working with bicycle chains. I wouldn't use it with bicycle chains because I have plenty of those, already. But for some people, they may have liked it for the idea of just having a really thick and easy to use chain tool that they might use on bicycle chains, and this actually wouldn't work out for you. Anyway, that's the all I had on this particular item. I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. Excuse me, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Catus Maximus out.